Something small faded, almost without a trace, and I noticed it only after it was gone. The house still looked the same, but it didn't sound the same anymore. I realized I hadn't heard my name being called for a while. There was a time when my name was repeated throughout the day. Small questions, simple calls, sometimes arriving when I was already tired. I used to answer without thinking much about it. When it stopped, I thought it meant something good. The quiet felt like space I had been missing. I assumed she was learning to manage on her own. But then I started to notice the way she moved around me. She no longer reached out the same way. It wasn't independence. It was distance taking shape quietly. The silence settled deeper than I expected. It wasn't peaceful, just unfamiliar in a way I couldn't ignore. What changed wasn't the house, it was the space between us. My name's Clara, and I've always wanted to be a present mother. Some days I get close to that version of myself. Other days feel unfinished, like I'm still catching up. That morning unfolded like most mornings do. I moved from one task to another without really thinking. Everything felt practiced, almost automatic. He sat at the table with his book open in front of him. Usually, questions would fill the space between us. That morning, the silence stayed longer than I noticed. My thoughts were somewhere else entirely. I was going over numbers, lists, and things I needed to fix. My answers came out short, just enough to move on. He used to ask again when something wasn't clear. There was always a second question, sometimes a third. Now, he stops at the first answer. I didn't notice it right away. The quiet made things feel easier somehow. It gave me space to finish what I needed. I thought it was a sign of growth, that he was learning to figure things out on his own. It felt like something to be relieved about. Something had shifted without asking for my attention. I didn't see it leave when it was still small. I only felt the absence once it was already gone. I started remembering her small habits. The way she used to ask questions without stopping. The way she lingered near me just to be noticed. Sometimes I answered without really listening. Sometimes I said later just to get through the moment. And most of the time that later never arrived. I never meant to ignore her. My mind just felt crowded all the time. Like there was no space left for anything else. I thought she would understand. That her mother was just tired. That this phase would quietly pass. But children don't see reasons the way we do. They feel what we give in the moment, and that feeling is what stays. Each unanswered question slowly turned into silence. Not all at once, but little by little. And I didn't notice when it changed. I began to feel something was missing. Not the noise, but the closeness. Something that once felt effortless. And then I found myself asking something I hadn't asked in a while. When was the last time I truly listened? Not just replying, but being there. I sat beside her that afternoon, not really sure what I was looking for. She was reading quietly, completely absorbed. The silence felt heavier than usual. I tried to start something small, something simple. I asked what she was reading. She answered, but it stayed short. I waited without realizing I was waiting. There was no follow-up, no extra thought. The moment ended before it began. It felt unfamiliar sitting that close, yet feeling so far. Nothing had changed on the surface, but something underneath had shifted. I tried again, quietly this time. But she returned to her page without hesitation. It felt like I was no longer needed there. That was when it settled in quietly. This wasn't about her becoming distant. It was about moments I didn't stay for. I remembered how often I was only half there, listening, but already thinking of the next thing. She must have felt that long before I did. Now she doesn't ask the way she used to. Not out of distance, but out of understanding. She learned that answers don't always come. Children ask because they trust someone is there, someone who will listen, even to the smallest things. I begin to see how simple that trust used to be. When that response fades, nothing breaks. There is no argument, no raised voice, just a quiet shift I didn't notice. Silence can feel harmless at first. It blends into the routine, but it slowly replaces something important. I thought I was managing my time well. Everything felt productive, structured, but something small kept slipping through. It was never about perfect answers. They didn't need everything explained. They just needed me there. Presence is not measured in hours. It shows in how fully I arrive, even briefly. I start to understand the difference now. I can't go back to those missed moments, but I can choose what happens next. Maybe it begins with something small. I sit closer this time. I listen a little longer than before, and I let the moment stay without rushing it away. That night, I chose to sit beside her without bringing anything with me. No phone, no task waiting in my hands. Just the quiet weight of being there. I didn't rush to fill the silence. It felt unfamiliar, but I let it stay. The space between us slowly softened. When I finally spoke, my voice felt different. Softer, without urgency. I asked as if the answer truly mattered. She looked at me for a moment longer than usual, as if checking if I would stay this time. Then she began slowly. I held myself back from responding too quickly. The urge was there, but I let it pass. Listening felt like learning something I had forgotten. Then, almost unnoticed, she asked something small. A simple question, easy to miss, but it stayed in the air longer than I expected. I answered without trying to be perfect, just enough to stay present. And for once, that felt like it was enough. That night didn't change everything, but something quietly returned between us, and we both seemed to recognize it. I used to think I needed the right answers, something complete, something helpful, but maybe that was never what she was looking for. Her questions were never just questions. They were small openings, invitations I didn't always notice. I see now how easily they passed me by. There was no noise when the distance began, no argument, no warning, just a quiet space growing where connection used to live. Listening doesn't look like much from the outside. No big gestures, no visible effort, but it holds more than I used to understand. It never needed extra time. Just the time I already had, offered differently, an attention that wasn't divided. She kept trying in her own quiet ways, small attempts I didn't always recognize, until slowly, they became less frequent. When she stopped, nothing felt different at first. The house stayed the same, but something underneath had shifted. Maybe it wasn't an ending, just something I was meant to notice, a quiet signal waiting for me to return. That day, something settled quietly inside me. Not a realization that came suddenly, but one that had been forming for a while. It felt simple, yet it stayed. I began to see how the small moments mattered more than I had allowed myself to believe. The ordinary, repeated things carried weight, and they stayed with her longer than I thought. I stopped thinking about being a perfect mother. That idea felt distant now. What stayed was the need to be present, even in small ways. Her questions were never just questions. They were small openings, ways she reached toward me without saying it directly. And I realized not every moment waits for us. Some pass quietly when we are not looking, and they do not always return the same way. But she is still here, still close, still within reach, and that quietly gives me another chance. It does not have to be something big or something immediate. Small steps, taken gently, feel enough for now. So today I try something different. I pause a little longer when she speaks, and I listen, not to answer, but to stay. I pause more often now when she starts talking. The moment feels small, but I try not to rush past it. I let myself stay, even if nothing urgent is happening. I still miss things sometimes, and I notice it more clearly now. There are moments I wish I had handled differently, but even that awareness begins to change how I respond. I begin to see that she is not waiting for perfect answers. She is simply looking for me in those moments, and sometimes that is already enough. When I hear other mothers share similar thoughts, I feel less alone in this. It becomes something we are quietly learning together. Not perfect, just ongoing. My name is Clara, and this is a small part of my journey. If you find yourself here too, you can stay for a while. We are growing quietly in our own time.